tranquila vida riding down the Congo. Got that Eldorado when my mama do the mambo. I so often see another while I'm banging on my bongo. They don't want me psycho vida reina of the jungle. Mira mi tranquila vida riding down the Congo. Got that Eldorado when my mama do the mambo. I so often see another while I'm banging on my bongo. Rolled out clean in the whip. Fly girl lean on scene in the bitch.
Welcome everyone. I will share this Spotify playlist in the chat if anyone is interested.
Let her beam, let her twist. Wine to remind and she twerk to resist. Working it, worship the earth and a dip. Stole it from Africa, seeking a gift. 16 on a ship. Bring me to the beat of the drum all day. One with the sun, let it lead my way. La hija de la diaspora. La hija de la diaspora. Yeah. Bring me to the beat of the drum all day. One with the sun, let it lead my way. La hija de la diaspora. La hija de la diaspora. Yeah. Mira mi tranquila vida riding down the Congo. Got that Eldorado when my mama do the mambo. I so often see another while I'm banging on my bongo. They don't want me psycho vida reina of the jungle. Mira mi tranquila vida riding down the Congo. Got that Eldorado when my mama do the mambo. I so often see another while I'm banging on my bongo. Freedom, my people, from here to Montego. Dale morena like this Puerto Rico. We go and we make it rain like El Nino. Got that sofrito, that primo, that negro. None of these hypnots is fucking with me though. We so cool, we ride off in El Camino. We gon' be CEO, no need no Nat Geo. Got so much juice, they just call me Tampico. Let it chill, let it drum all day. One with the sun, let it lead my way. La hija de la diaspora. La hija de la diaspora. Yeah. Bring me to the beat of the drum all day. One with the sun, let it lead my way.
Hi, everyone. We're going to get started in a few minutes, but I just wanted to share that this event is going to be in English with Spanish language interpretation. Unfortunately, we were unable to secure live captioning for tonight's event, but we will be recording and subtitling the event, and we will publicize that resource in the coming days. Next, I'm going to share some of these instructions with monolingual Spanish speakers about how they can access the interpretation setting, and then we will return to primarily English language facilitation. Buenas tardes a todos y todas y todes. Este evento será en inglés con interpretación disponible en español. Si usted necesita interpretación en español, seleccione el icono del globo que está en la parte baja de su pantalla y seleccione español. Si no ve el icono del mundo, tendrá que actualizar su Zoom y volver a entrar a la plataforma. Si se está sintonizando por Facebook Live, no estamos sintonizando por Facebook Live, pero si necesita apoyo de interpretación, solo ponga un mensaje ahí en el chat y le vamos a dar apoyo. Si tiene preguntas para los ponentes, por favor use la función de preguntas que también está en la parte baja de su pantalla en Zoom. Muchas gracias. Okay.
Thank you, Sam, for sharing instructions. While we are rolling in, if folks want to, please introduce yourself in the chat. If you want to share your name and pronouns, your organization, if you are affiliated with anyone. Also, what brought you here to tonight's webinar? Also, and also utilize the chat with any comments or reactions. And just as a reminder, this event is going to be recorded, is currently recording. So please feel free to turn off your camera. Looking forward to meeting y'all in the chat. Welcome, folks. Thank you for sharing your names in the chat.
Bum bum dreaming to the beat of the fitted drum. Sung from the tongue of the native one. Bum bum dreaming to the beat of the fitted drum. Sung from the tongue of the native one. The spirit is alive. Light another fire if you fucking with the tribe. Vibe, just said the spirit is alive. Light another fire if you fucking with the tribe. This is the story of the diaspora, a tribute to the daughters of a maroon society. Yo soy negra y latina.
I'll get started after this song ends. Great. Thank you, everyone. And please continue to introduce yourself in the chat. We'll go ahead and get started as we want to be respectful of your time this evening. We should be wrapping up a little over an hour and a half from now. Before we get started, just wanted to ground us in this space and do a land acknowledgement. We would like to open tonight's webinar by recognizing that we are on unceded Natochtank and Piscataway territories, the first in the Western Hemisphere to encounter European colonists. There is a history and legacy of violence, displacement, forced migration, and settlement that made way for us to be here. We acknowledge our positionality and responsibility as settler colonists, as many of us are DC transplants, and we are committed to learning the histories of this area and advancing the ongoing struggles of DC's native and local communities and the connections to US imperialism. If we can just take a moment of silence for a couple of seconds to really let this reality sink in. Thank you. I would like to pass over to one of my comrades, Rebecca.
Thank you so much, Kai Kai, for that land acknowledgement. It's very important that we recognize that this land was stolen. So we're gonna move on to the next part. And basically, I'm gonna introduce y'all to DIWA and what DIWA is, and a little bit of history, and then we'll go on to our cultural performance. And I'll pass it back over to Kai Kai. So DIWA is a DC chapter of the International Women's Alliance, a global alliance of grassroots-based women's organizations, institutions, alliances, networks, and individuals united in establishing a democratic, anti-imperialist, progressive women's movement in the 21st century. During the third international conference of the International League of People's Struggle held in Hong Kong in June 2008, the Women's Commission resolved to hold an international conference of women in 2010. The centennial year of the International Toiling Women's Day to advance women's participation in the people's struggle against imperialist and capitalist aggression. The conference proved to be a milestone, and on August 16th, the International Women's Alliance was formed. The first step in advancing and strengthening a militant global women's liberation movement in the 21st century. DIWA, a DC chapter of the International Women's Alliance, was launched in April 2019 as a unity to intensify local struggles and campaigns against imperialism and capitalism, strengthen international solidarity, and contribute to the people's struggle for national liberation, sovereignty, and self-determination. Since our launch, DIWA has deepened relationship with CISPES DC, also known as Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador, PACA, also known as Pan-African Community Action, Gabriela DC, and Katarangan DC. Thank you. I'm going to go pass to my comrade, Kai Kai.
Thank you, Rebecca, for giving a little highlight of who we are as DIWA, as an alliance, and recognizing that tonight is about a night of unity in resistance. Also in resistance alongside our work, there is the importance of also cultural joy and music. And so I would like to introduce our first cultural performer, Miss Luci Murphy. Ms. Luci Murphy is a native of Washington, D.C., where she is a vocalist who often leads group singing, but sunlights as a medical interpreter of Spanish and English. She has a long history of community activism, especially working with children at risk. Ms. Luci has been performing since her childhood in the 1950s, and to reach the members of our diverse human family, she sings in 10 languages. She draws on the folkloric traditions and musical idioms of all of these cultures, as well as her own roots in spirituals, blues, and jazz. Ms. Luci, thank you for being here with us this evening.
Thank you, Kai Kai. I'm so happy to hear the land acknowledgement, because I think land and housing is so important, and women have taken the leadership in holding and recovering land and also housing, struggling against displacement. And I'm looking forward to the sisters on this call in this area, helping out with the Brookland Manor Tenants Association, which is fighting displacement. This is a large complex of apartments, 535 units. Of large apartments for families. You know, many of our families have aunts, uncles, grandmas, grandchildren, cousins, brothers, sisters, and they need space to grow and develop. And Brookland Manor has 3, 4, and 5 bedroom units. And the mayor has authorized mid-city development to redevelop Brookland Manor as efficiencies 1 and 2 bedrooms. And so a song that I'm going to sing call and response style, and of course, because of the delay in Zoom, you all can't unmute yourselves, but stay on mute and repeat after me. We ain't gonna move. We ain't gonna move when we hold together. And actually, if people don't know how to do that, is we ain't gonna move. We ain't gonna move. We ain't gonna move when we hold together. We make ourselves strong. Together we stay here. Right where we belong.
Right where we belong.
We ain't gonna move.
We ain't gonna move.
We ain't gonna move.
We ain't gonna move.
Actually, you all don't sound too bad, even with the delay. I'm gonna sing a verse and then let's do the chorus again. This city is where my children were born, but the landlord says children can't stay in my home. Somebody please tell me where children belong. We ain't gonna move. We ain't gonna move. Let's do that chorus again. We ain't gonna move.
We ain't gonna move.
move.
We ain't gonna move
We ain't gonna move.
when we hold together.
When we hold
Hold
together,
together,
We make ourselves strong.
we make ourselves strong.
strong.
Together we stay here,
Together we stay here,
right where we belong.
right
Right.
where
Where
we
we
belong.
belong.
We ain't gonna move.
We ain't gonna move.
We ain't gonna move.
We ain't gonna
Gonna
move.
move.
The landlord has troubles. The landlord has woes. Maintenance cost money. Everybody knows. He contributes so much money to the mayor's race. He can't fix up my place. But I ain't gonna pay that rent increase. We ain't gonna move.
We
We ain't gonna move
We ain't gonna move.
when we hold together.
When we
We
hold
hold
together,
together.
We make ourselves strong.
we make ourselves strong.
Together we stay here, right where we belong. We ain't gonna move. We ain't gonna move. We ain't gonna move. We ain't gonna move when we hold together. We make ourselves strong. Together we stay here, right where we belong. We ain't gonna move. We ain't gonna move. I'd like to say that when we sing together, we breathe together, and our hearts beat together. And that's why when we do sing together, we get that special feeling of power, of being united. And this is something that we need to bring, we need to revive, because with the alienation and isolation and the star tripping that's going on with commercial music, we've lost the courage to sing. You know, we're vulnerable to people criticizing the way we sound, and we shouldn't be, because we all have voices, and we need to use those voices, and we need to use those voices for unity and for our people. Herbie Hancock said there are no wrong notes, just unexpected ones. So with that, I invite people to sing at the 1DC Black Workers Center. We have a 1DC Black Workers Center chorus, which is open to people of color who support the Black workers, and Black workers, of course. We have been meeting on a fairly regular basis, but with August, we may take a little break because we need to go and do a lot of things for Black August and for good activities like this one. But with that, I'll put my information in the chat. So if anyone wishes to continue this conversation, is that okay, Kai Kai?
Yes, please share all of this information. Thank you so much, Miss Luci.
Rebecca, you're on mute.
You're on mute, Rebecca.
Okay. I should check that, huh? Thank you. Okay, thank you so much, Miss Luci. That was beautiful. Please do share that information in the chat, and we're gonna move on to the next slide so we can continue on. So we wanted to make sure that we start from a place, the same place when it comes to defining certain terms. And during this webinar, we're going to be talking about these terms that you see here on the screen, right? We're going to talk about capitalism, imperialism, neoliberalism, colonialism, colonialism, and domestic or internal colonialism. So we want to make sure that everyone has a standard definition for all of those terms, and that we are at the same place. So I'm just gonna, quickly read these, and then the panelists will talk about these terms throughout their speeches. So capitalism is a competitive social economic system based on the private ownership of the means of production like machines, tools, factories, distribution, so trucks, trains, planes, stores, and exchange, so the banks, the stocks, by capitalists who exploit workers, those who must sell their labor in return for wages or a salary to make profit, also known as surplus value, and accumulate wealth. And so then we're going to move on to imperialism. And imperialism is the highest form of capitalism, right? It's a monopoly stage of capitalism. In that stage of development, there's dominance of monopolies, and finance capital is established, in which the export of capital has acquired pronounced importance, right? And in which the division of the world among the international trusts has begun, in which the division of all territories of the globe among the biggest capitalist powers have been completed. And so this is a definition from Lenin, right? So, we are, based on this definition, living in an imperialist global world, right? And then we have neoliberalism, and it's a set of ideas or doctrines that holds free market capitalism as the best way of ensuring prosperity and freedom, quote unquote freedom, for all. And neoliberalism reorients the role of the state to better serve the needs of monopoly capital. The state's role, according to neoliberal doctrine, is not to take direct responsibility for the ensuring the common good, but to create and preserve institutional framework that promotes and protects private property rights, free trade, and free markets for corporations. Then we're going to talk about colonialism, and colonialism is related to capitalism, as you can see in the definitions. So this is the formal definition of colonialism: is the policy of a nation attempting to impose its authority over another people and land for the purposes of economic exploitation for the benefits of the colonizing power. This was the policy of most European powers that resulted in the enrichment of Europe that began with the European invasion of 1492 by Christopher Columbus. Colonization can be either direct with direct rule of the territory, and might include, stationing of administrative and military personnel, or indirect with authority being exercised through the indigenous authorities, also known as neocolonialism. In both processes, though, the colonizing power seeks to impose its religion, economics, and cultural practices on the population. And then we'll get into more detail about settler colonialism and domestic colonialism. So real quick, settler colonialism is a specific form of colonialism where an imperial power seizes native territory, eliminates original people by force, and resettles the land with a foreign invading population, AKA the United States, Israel, et cetera, et cetera. And domestic, also known as internal colonialism, has the same elements of exploitation as the formal colonialism, and it relies on a categorization of subordinate race who plays the essential role for the colonial system, being both a force of labor to the ruling class, while at the same time being a product to profit on itself. So there'll be a little bit more about that. So another example of internal colonialism is the economic and political state of Africans or Black people here in the United States, which is a settler colonial state. So with that, I'm going to pass it to the next person.
Yes. Thank you so much, Rebecca, for laying down the groundwork for definitions of what will be covered today. I know that was a lot of text on the slide, but we did want to be sure that we're on the same page. But we'll have a better understanding of how these definitions come into play with our speakers. And I would like to introduce our first speaker of the night, Quisha Bradley of PACA, the Pan-African Community Action. PACA is a grassroots group of African and Black people organizing for community-based power in DC. PACA undertakes to build community-led power through political education and participatory programs of action that avow and advance our human right to informed consent, self-determination, and collective community control over elements of land, political systems, economic systems, systems of justice, social systems, and ecological systems. Quisha, thank you so much for being here tonight.
Thank you so much, Kai Kai, and thank you so much, Miss Luci, for getting us started on that note. I'm so jazzed right now. And thank you to all of our attendees joining us tonight. We really appreciate you. So today I will briefly go over settler colonialism and policing. So to kind of pick up where my comrade Rebecca left off, what is colonialism? So again, colonialism is defined as control by one power over a dependent area or people. It occurs when one nation subjugates another, conquering its population and exploiting it, often while forcing its own language and cultural values upon its people. Features of colonialism include a mother country or metropole, and a colony that is structured to benefit the mother country. So it's one country in power, but having two separate locations. So an example would be Roman Empire and their conquest of Spain, Gaul, and so many other regions. Another example will be the colonization of Africa and other regions by European powers in the 17th and 19th century. Next slide, please. So what is settler colonialism? Settler colonialism is a distinct type of colonialism that functions through the replacement of indigenous populations with an invasive settler society. So over time, the settler society develops a distinct identity and sovereignty. Another way of putting it is settler colonialism is European domination, right? And some examples are the United States, of course, Canada, Australia, Israel, of course, just to name a few. Next slide, please. So settler colonialism is distinct from classical colonialism, neo-colonialism, or domestic colonialism in that, one, settler collectives permanently occupy and assert sovereignty over indigenous lands. Settler colonial invasion is also a structure, not an individual one-off event. And again, not a temporary type structure. When it's set up permanently. Like, this is mine now, you're being replaced or erased. Also, the distinction is that the end goal of settler colonialism is to create a supreme, unchallenged settler state and people. Next slide, please. So the strategies deployed, give me a second to read this quote and it all links together, but really like this quote. So wanted to put it as kind of, we went over the definition, the theory, how does that play out into practice, including into present day examples of settler colonialism, right? So The strategies deployed by settler colonialism to subjugate Black people in the United States has evolved over time based on the shift in settler policy from the initial drive to create an ever-expanding slave labor force to generate profits, to the perception of Black people as a surplus population that need to be contained and controlled. These white supremacist logics not only enabled the system of slavery, but they continue to enable the systems that treat Black people as the permanent property of the state, such as discriminatory police violence and mass incarceration. So this ties into one of 7 of PACA's tools of analysis in seeing African or Black communities as a domestic colony within the United States, exploited for labor, resources, and occupied by police force in our neighborhoods, right? We see it to this day. Police force is the main tool used by the ruling class to protect their wealth, to implement their will, and enforce the colonial domination over working class, Black, Indigenous, and other marginalized people. So how or why did we get here? Next slide, please. So terra nullius, put in the chat if anyone has ever heard of this Latin phrase, terra nullius. And it's Latin for land belonging to no one. So settlers use this concept to establish their own private property, right? The idea that lands in long-term use by Indigenous peoples are empty or unused created a narrative in the opportunity for settlers. From the beginning, settler identity and material belongings was tied to private property. And as we know through social science, with the stratification of the classes, the haves and the have-nots, there exists an occupying force to protect the property or what the haves have from those who do not. Next slide, please. So settler states formed frontier police forces. Pictured here is the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. There were also various Australian mounted police forces, as well as, of course, the American Cavalry of the Wild Wild West. These forces had extraordinary power over Indigenous peoples, including the ability to apprehend children, to prevent people from leaving official reserve lands, the ability to control employment, and to direct police or military forces against Indigenous people. These extreme powers are exercised based on carefully constructed racist narratives that still exist to this day. Next slide, please. So comparisons can still be clearly drawn between these early frontier forces and policing of African, Indigenous, working class communities to this day. For example, US Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE's, detainment and sterilization of immigrant women, right? Like, what does my citizenship or immigration status have to do with my ovaries? The protection of private property during protests, even white militia groups standing up to guard private property, right? We also see it present day in police occupation of African, Indigenous, and poor working class communities. Next slide, please. So this is a lot. I don't want to end on a doom and gloom note, because there are a lot of opportunities, right? That's why we do the work we do. That's why you all chose to join us tonight. You could be doing anything in the world, but you were spending your time together to learn to build, so we appreciate you. So let's talk about the opportunities. 2020 was an interesting year for most people in this world. For some people, it was the first time that certain contradictions were heightened, right? The pandemic, climate change, race relations, continuous acts of state-sanctioned violence helped to raise some level of consciousness and hopefully compelled people to come to grips with social transformation, but also reimagining what the world could be, right? So this is why we say now is the time to shift power into the hands of working class African, indigenous peoples, particularly women, members of LGBTQI community, and other marginalized communities that otherwise never had a voice, never had representation. Well, we've always had a voice and representation, just it's been a fight and a struggle. And by shifting power, by power in particular, we mean the ability to implement or enact an idea, belief, will, opinion, plan, or decision, and the capacity to protect the outcome, because that is true power. As Kwame Ture says, if a white man wants to lynch me, that's his problem, right? If a white man has the power to lynch me, that's my problem. In closing, I will say PACA is empowered to continue our call and our CCOP campaign, which is the Community Control Over Police campaign. PACA is also a part of the DC chapter of National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression. This group also has a main mantle of taking up community control over police in various cities across the nation. So kind of the push and the opportunity in the Community Control Over Police campaign is giving us all the opportunity to wage positive action campaigns in the most impacted communities with the intent or objective of building community-based power led by the most impacted, not just by petty bourgeois people who have money or accessibility to have their voices heard. And last, but certainly not least, to assert our human right to self-determination. So with that, I will conclude and sit back and listen to my fellow panelists, and looking forward to further discussion in the question and answer. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Quisha, for sharing PACA's work and also giving us a deeper understanding of how settler colonialism works and how to this day, the police continues to be an act of this, or, forces of the state. And just to echo your call of how can we build with the working class, with the most marginalized in this work. And so I'd also like to now move toward, oh, yes, Quisha.
Just noting, we are the DC chapter of the International Women's Alliance. Mm-hmm. If it's not obvious, international solidarity is key. So it's about politically educating yourself so you're clear and can analyze your situation, but also linking our struggles, because there is a clear line and a clear enemy. But I'll stop there. Thank you.
Yes, perfect segue to our next panel speaker, Joachim Bao from Gabriela DC. Gabriela DC is a member organization of Gabriela USA, the first overseas chapter of Gabriela National Women's Alliance in the Philippines. Specifically, GAB DC, this chapter was formed as a vehicle to empower Filipino women in our communities whose human rights and welfare were being attacked and neglected. Founders of GAB DC united to rise up, take action, and advance the national democratic movement as a path to genuine liberation, equality, and justice for all marginalized Filipinos in the motherland and abroad. Joe?
Thank you, Kai, and good evening, everyone. So yes, I think what we're hearing tonight from our panelists is just how we are linking our struggles together and how we're connected by a common enemy. So I wanted to share tonight the impact of particularly US imperialism on Filipino women. So half of the Philippine population are women, and women in the Philippines and abroad experience the problems faced by the Filipino people, the majority of whom are from the peasant and working class. So we see that the Filipino people are suffering, even though the Philippines is rich in natural resources, because the country's wealth is really unfairly distributed. And it really describes, we'll see how the class distribution of the Filipino population, how the interests of the majority are not met because the interests of the small ruling class and the big foreign businesses, really those are the ones that will prevail in Philippine society. So as Gabriela, Washington, DC, we link the struggles of Filipino women to the three basic problems of Philippine society, which are imperialism, meaning that the ruling interests of foreign monopoly, capitalism, primarily of the US, in the fields of economy, politics, and culture of Philippine society. They dominate the political affairs of the country. Feudalism, being a monopoly of just a few landlords over the vast agricultural lands that keeps our agricultural or our economy backwards, and farming is isolated. And then bureaucrat capitalism, being that the government runs like a business in the Philippines, and really in that way, we're talking about the ruling elite using their connections and their collaborations with foreign governments to pursue their interests in our country. And at the same time, we have a government, a Philippine government that uses the state, particularly the military and police, against the people to keep suppressing the people. So as Filipino women, we see that our liberation can only be attained until we dismantle take down the three basic problems of Philippine society. So I wanted to also kind of describe more so the character of Philippine society. Really, when we mean semi-colonial, we're talking about how the US colony still the Philippines is an indirect US colony with a sham independence. We're not truly liberated as a country, but it is US rule that is being implemented through laws, through foreign agreements that really allow the Philippine government on the country's economy and politics to really carry out the interests of foreign governments and not the interests of the people. And then semi-feudalism, meaning that while the feudal condition in agriculture really remains in the country, in the countryside, it serves only the foreign monopoly capitalists. For example, we don't necessarily produce or grow products that are for the consumption of our own people, but instead they're for the sale for overseas. And the same is the way that we are using our lands and the natural resources that are being extracted from our country. So this semi-feudal and semi-colonial character of our society is also embedded in the feudal patriarchal culture that manifests. And this is really what is one of the root causes of oppression of Filipino women. Next slide. So when we're talking about the three layers of women's oppression, we're talking about national oppression, right? Because the country is still dictated over the ruling elite and US imperialism, class exploitation, and systemic oppression in the form of patriarchy. So when we mean by a feudal patriarchal system, it's really limiting the women's role in society, or how the woman is viewed in society as a whole. And that the women's oppression is really linked to her role in production of society. So for Gabriela, Philippines and all Gabriela chapters around the world, it's really about encouraging the power of women and empowering women to really use their voice, but also to be able to fight back these layers of oppression. Oh, next slide. So with that context, right, of how the three basic problems and US imperialism, right, being one of them, how does that actually impact the lives of women? So just to note, we see that US imperialism in the Philippines actually worsens the women's situation and the conditions of women. One, it seems that women are considered or treated inferior to that of men. That the women's labor and bodies can be sold as commodities, And when women are seen to be freed, quote unquote, from the home, it's only to be used as the source of the country's cheap labor force abroad. So we really see that women being used as commodities is seeing them as being a source of export of the country because of the unemployment, the dire poverty that's being faced in the Philippines. A lot of women have no choice but to find means or jobs abroad, or try to seek opportunities that are outside of the country. And so much more, they are put in precarious conditions like human trafficking, and labor exploitation, or even labor recruitment schemes. And we see this as one way of how really US imperialism, how it keeps our local economy in the Philippines repressed. And so that when there is that repression experienced in our homeland, our Filipino women are desperate and can be vulnerable and taken advantage of, right, in the economic sense. So women are also the first to be fired during an economic crisis. While they're expected, right, to serve in that capacity of taking care of the home, the family, and the children, their labor is very much devalued. Next slide. So I also wanted to just highlight here the commodification of Filipino women and LGBTQ gender non-conforming peoples, because of one of the impacts that imperialism has in the Philippines is an ever increasing military presence in our home country. And like the definition that was described earlier about neoliberalism and the monopoly capitalism, and the economic system as a whole, and how that impacts the Philippines, is really key to understanding why there's such a strong US military presence in our home country. And it's really to protect the interests, like we said, about the ruling elite. It is to ensure that the foreign companies, the monopolies, have their hands on our natural resources. But in order to do that, right, in order to accomplish those goals, the US really needs a strong military policing presence in the Philippines. And it needs that in order to carry out its own strategic interests in our country. When we see this happen, and this is a long history of military and police presence in the Philippines, when we see this happen time and time again, we also see a correlation to our women being also attacked by military officers or US military personnel who take advantage of the vulnerabilities of women. So whether that be through rape, domestic violence and abuse, or even killings. And just to highlight one of the campaigns or larger campaigns that Gabriela USA has taken up over the years, and Gabriela DC, is that of Jennifer Laude's campaign, Justice for Jennifer Laude. And we really see how the state-sponsored violence through military presence in our country is perpetuated. It's really where we saw here Jennifer Laude being a 26-year-old trans woman who was found strangled to death by a US Marine Corporal, Joseph Scott Pemberton. And later, this case was deemed as a homicide. And it was clearly the result of a violent hate crime towards transgender people, but also underscores the inequality within these the Visiting Forces Agreement, which is a military agreement between the US and the Philippines that really enables the US military to be in the Philippines for a long term without any type of regulations and being able to increase US personnel overseas. So we really see how this military presence translates into more abuse of Filipino women and trans people. And I think in terms of the next speaker, I think this is also relevant, not only in the Philippines, but all over the world, where we see US military and police presence, how our communities are unsafe, how we're constantly in danger, but also the ever growing need for an international response against US imperialism and militarization.
Thank you, Joe, for making those connections already to our next speaker, Yessi. And just to even recap, for already two speakers, the violence of the hands of the state, of just the police presence, and how the hands of the state are really trying to get a hold of our literal bodies as commodities to really keep increasing the profits of the United States. For our last speaker, I would like to highlight another member org, CISPES, and Yesenia Portillo will be speaking on behalf of CISPES. CISPES is a grassroots solidarity organization that has been supporting the Salvadoran people's struggle for social and economic justice since 1980. CISPES organizes strategic campaigns against US government and corporate intervention in El Salvador and accompany the Salvadoran popular movement in its work to realize an inspiring vision of participatory democracy and economic justice. Yessi?
Hi, everyone. My name is Yesenia, and I'm an organizer with the CISPES, the Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador. And I'm not sure if folks can see me.
We can see.
Awesome. Okay. So before going on into CISPES's current campaign and responding to the political repression and violence in El Salvador's current president, Nayib Bukele, and our campaign to cut harmful US military, police, and economic quote-unquote development financing to Central America, I'd like to briefly share some history since what we're seeing today with President Bukele and with the Biden administration is a continuation of colonial cis heteropatriarchal violence. So next slide. Like the rest of what is known today as Latin America, colonial violence in so-called El Salvador has led to centuries of profit-driven and violent land displacement for indigo plantations and later costly exportation, for example, by Spanish, British, and other settlers, all of which have been met with a very long history of resistance from African, indigenous, Afro-Indigenous, and campesino communities. Next slide. Because I don't have much time, I'm gonna skip to the early 1900s, following the Spanish-American War of the late 1800s, when the US began to make its presence clearly felt in nearby countries with invasions in Nicaragua, Panama, and Guatemala. And there were mass protests in El Salvador attended by wide sectors of Salvadoran society denouncing the US presence in Central America. This included Salvadoran feminists and included Prudencia Ayala, for example. Prudencia Ayala is an icon of Salvadoran history, most widely known for being the first woman in Latin America to run for president in 1930. And the fact that she was an anti-imperialist feminist is often left out. And folks can look to the work of historians like Dr. Hector Lindo, which I cite here, for example, for a bit more about this. She even used to give conferences about anti-imperialism. So another extremely significant period in Salvadoran history is what is known as La Matanza of 1932, wherein tens of thousands of mostly indigenous Salvadorans were killed within a few days. And I want to mention the role of the US in legitimizing the genocidal military dictator that rose to prominence during that time, General Maximiliano Hernandez Martinez. If you look at US State Department documents and their commitment to protecting their capitalist interests, the US government broke official protocol and politically supported him, which gave way to over half a century of these repressive military dictatorships in El Salvador, which protected the interests of a very small group of extremely wealthy families. It was against these brutal the repression of these US-backed military dictatorships that Salvadorans once again took up arms from 1980 to 1992. And CISPES was born as part of the international solidarity movement led by Salvadoran refugees mobilizing from within the US to pressure the US government to stop financing the Salvadoran military dictatorship, or the Salvadoran military. Next slide. Following the signing of the 1992 peace accords, CISPES has continued its accompaniment of working class struggles in El Salvador. And the United States has, of course, continued to play an interventionist role, working with the Salvadoran elite to continue to secure the profits of US, Salvadoran, and transnational corporations. And, you know, I just listed some examples here of US foreign policy, but despite the billions in US financing that have continued to flow to the region in the name of supposedly solving the problems of economic insecurity and violence, what we've seen in the US, is the US imposing economic restructuring of El Salvador into a more export-driven economy, imposing what is known as mano dura policies, or US-style punitive and increased militarized policing and prisons, and the privileging of the private sector and of the business class within essential services. So while my family, along with 500,000 other Salvadorans, fled during the brutal US financed civil war in the 80s, another 1.5 million Salvadorans have joined them in the years since as a consequence of the ongoing violence of US interventions through things called the Central American Free Trade Agreement under Bush, or CAFTA, the Central American Regional Security Initiative in 2005, and the Alliance for Prosperity under the Obama administration. Next slide, please. So this just to say that the Biden-Harris administration's current push to spend more money in Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador to supposedly address the root causes of migration from the region, it's a mere continuation of over a century of US interventionism and neocolonialism. And CISPES has been collaborating with other Central American solidarity organizations, immigrant rights orgs, and groups in the region, fighting against land theft and that are pushing back against these policies, which lead to increased poverty, violence, and environmental destruction. As the Senate works to finalize its own version of the federal budget, it's not too late for folks to join us in taking action. And the link for that is here, cispes.org/take-action. And we're also asking folks to tweet at the Senate appropriations. And we have sample tweets at the bit.ly there, bit.ly/RR real, I think it's like real root causes. Anyways, you can see it there. Next slide. The Biden-Harris plan for Central America, in addition to centering first and foremost profit making of US and transnational corporations, which I kind of put some information there about the NGO with all those corporations in that picture that the Vice President Harris is promoting. Basically, it's this NGO that all those corporations are on the board of that are supposedly going to solve Central America's economic crisis. So in addition to centering that, the plan also is to continue to militarize the region. And the question here is, what does this all mean for El Salvador with the rise of fascism under President Nayib Bukele, a right-wing populist whose first speech as president-elect was at the ultra-right-wing think tank, the Heritage Foundation. He had an extremely friendly relationship with the Trump administration and seems to be at odds with the current heads of state in Washington. But for me and for us at CISPES, it's clear that even though they may seem like enemies, where these administrations' values lie in relation to the masses is the same. What we've seen in the last 2 years of the Bukele administration is a dismantling of the basic protections of human rights and democracy that were secured when the peace accords were signed. President Bukele rhymes via campaigns of disinformation via Twitter and other social media platforms, printed and television news media, covering up the reality of rapidly increasing cis heteropatriarchal violence that comes along with his brand of increased militarism and decreased spending on programs intended to serve the needs of women, queer, and gender nonconforming folks. In his interview with President Bukele, Puerto Rican rapper Residente from Calle 13 seems to have fallen, like many, for Bukele's facade of a hip, cool millennial. In this interview, Bukele told the world he didn't believe in marriage equality and characterized abortions as genocide. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the Bukele administration was widely denounced and continues to be by feminist groups for making false claims about Salvadoran women, supposedly being more safe during his presidency, while their lived experiences have actually been characterized by increased violence and femicides towards trans women in particular, and accompanied by a wide-ranging dismantling of social services that were intended to provide them with safety and support. The Bukele administration's political violence against his opposition is also particularly misogynistic in nature. From a misogynistic army of trolls attacking women journalists to attacks in the post-election period, where a popular blogger who received media passes from a government news network and formed part of Bukele's political party propaganda arm, engaged in extremely violent and public verbal sexual harassment towards several candidates of the leftist opposition party, the FMLN. Instead of denouncing the behavior, President Bukele took to Twitter to further attack the victims, Daniela Genovez. This occurred a little over a month after Bukele administration employees carried out a mass shooting against elderly FMLN activists who were leaving a campaign event, leaving 2 ex-revolutionary fighters dead. And I'm wrapping up, I know it's time. The National Police and the Bukele administration, instead of denouncing these attacks, attempted to cover up and make excuses for them. And so, yeah, I just want to close out. There's so much more that I could say about everything that has happened under the Bukele administration and why El Salvador is rapidly returning to a time before the peace accords were signed, and the urgency of paying attention to what's happening there. But yeah, I just want to close out with our current and urgent call to action, which is that following a legislative coup in May, where the Bukele-aligned legislators illegally replaced the Attorney General, the justice system has come after 5 former public officials of the FMLN. They've been illegally arrested without due process on what's being denounced as false charges of corruption. They're being denied medical attention. And yeah, given all the context, it's a really dangerous situation. So we would really appreciate folks signing on to a petition that we're sharing around at cispes.org/political prisoners. So I will leave it there. And if there's more time in the questions, I will go ahead and share more. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jessie. I know that we have been providing a lot of information and very different, well, not necessarily very different at all. Actually, we have very shared similar struggle. And we have seen even here on like the US again, continuing wanting to spend more money, hopefully to address the root causes. They are the root cause, aren't they not? But don't we know that when we send more money, that often is used for more military intervention, more military presence, creating more unsafe environments for civilians and critics, dissenters, human rights activists. While we are gathering the questions, I know that some folks may have to leave, so that's why I want to make sure that folks do have the opportunity to follow us on social media if you have not already. Facebook.com/DIWA.DMV, Instagram @DIWA.DMV, or shoot us an email at DIWA.DMV@gmail.com. And right now we are going to gather questions So continue to send to the Q&A right now, but wanted to give a little shout out to this next event that is going to be happening, hosted by IWA, so the International IWA, that is Women Against Wars of Aggression on the 26th. Oh, it is September 26th, not, is that correct, Jess? It is September 26th, not August 26th. Oh, we have some time. So please join us then. It's really great to hop on these webinars because as you see here, there are so many different times listed. A lot of different folks from all over the world will be joining, and it allows us, as Quisha was mentioning earlier, we need to be learning our individual struggles, and you will be learning what is happening all over the world here on this next webinar. So how can we then connect it to our own and really continue to rise and be in unity in resistance against imperialism. We could now move to questions with DIWA. I have one question. This is directly for Gabriela and CISPES, but of course, PACA, please feel free to also add in. Question is, as organizers in the US imperialist core, geographically far from our homelands, what do groups like Gabriela and CISPES see as their responsibility for advancing their respective national liberation struggles? I will also post that in the chat if you want to reread.
I mean, I can start and speak for myself, I guess, as an organizer with CISPES, and I think having had the experience of my family being forcibly displaced and not learning throughout my childhood and not really coming to understand the role of the U.S. government in my and my family's lived experiences until I was basically an adult. I think you know, and living here in so-called DC, where the second or the first largest, I think, immigrant population from Latin America is Salvadoran. So the Salvadoran community is a very transnational one. About 2 million Salvadorans live in the US, and the population of El Salvador is 6 million. So we do play a very important role from the imperialist core of educating our community, our larger community, of, you know, this very, very long history of colonial fascist violence that really permeates our psyche as a transnational community, and that really allows for us to be okay, and a lot of us to be okay with this kind of violence, anti-Black violence, anti-Indigenous violence that then gets exported to El Salvador. So I think continuing to connect these struggles is a really, I think I see as our responsibility. I don't know if that kind of answers the question.
Thank you, Yessi. I think it is very important to consistently even question, right? Why are we here in the United States? And that again brings us to the forced migrations, the different patterns, you know, like in the Philippines, like the labor export policy programs that really create the conditions, and especially with US imperialism and histories of colonialism, we don't have the conditions for livelihood, for jobs. There's constant violence. So we feel forced to move to have these better opportunities for livelihood. Yet this violence continues, as you're mentioning, Yessi. Joe, did you want to add on to this question? I think you might still be away. Quisha, did you want to answer part of this as well?
I did, thank you. I know PACA wasn't mentioned, but thank you for the person who asked the question, because there's definitely something we could add here. So Pan-African Community Action, as it's in the name, we are Pan-Africanists. So those of us in PACA believe we are Africans who were born in America. one of our actually our very first tool of analysis that we all unify around as members of PACA is that it is for the liberation of Africa. And that, give me 1 second. Sorry. Okay, that is for the liberation of Africa under one economic system of socialism. And we say until Africa is free, no African anywhere can be free, right? So we lift up things that are happening with the diaspora. For example, we were very involved with the Black Alliance for Peace's solidarity with what was going on in Haiti. We also lift up Africom, and we talk about the militarization still going on the African continent. So we sprinkle this into our own political education with the hopes of, again, broadening that thought process for Africans in the US who think they may be separate than Africans elsewhere, but also linking it to Afro-Indigenous communities everywhere, right? So again, political education is just big, as well as figuring out what is happening in your respective country that you're supporting to be able to lift up those voices and bring it over here as well. Because as we saw with countless killings last year, international solidarity is huge and needed. And while there's huge and a lot of anti-Blackness in the world, we do get support as well. Like look at the Black Lives Matters march in Gaza and the signs that went up to RIP George Floyd after his public lynching. So it's a very important question. Thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to also add on to what Krisha said, Rebecca. Just kind of extend that a little bit, right? She talked about Africom, which is basically the United States having, military bases in practically all of the countries in Africa. And there is also Southcom, which are the military bases in the Caribbean and that area of in the West. And so when we talk about imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, the U.S., the United States, is an empire, and they're trying to protect their capitalism through imperialism, right? And so they have Southcom, they have Africom, and then here in the United States, the police are heavily militarized. There's programs where the federal government is transferring weapons, military grade weapons, to the local police departments, right? In DC and even locally in the DMV area. There is the 1033 program. There is Operation Relentless Pursuit, et cetera, et cetera. So when we really look at and we connect the struggles that are going on here in the United Snakes, yes, I said United Snakes, to those in the Philippines and El Salvador and Nicaragua and Cuba and Colombia, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, you can see the connections. They're very clear. And one of the strategies that the capitalists use here in the belly of the beast is to divide and conquer and try to, control the corporate media so that we can't see the connections in our struggle. When they had they had murdered George Floyd in the US, there was people all over the world that were in protest. But who saw those in America? Who did the public in America know about those? Probably not. So we really need to, lift up this idea of unity and resistance and international solidarity. So that's all I wanted to add.
Can I just jump in?
Yeah.
Rebecca brings up another good point about corporate media, that's a part of what Joe mentioned as well, just the role of corporations having such a big role in our society. But I digress. That's for a future webinar.
Webinar part 2. Joe, if you want to hop in.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think that, you know, in addition, as Gabriela DC, we do not separate the struggles of Filipino women here in the US or Filipino people in general here in the United States or abroad in any other country, separate from the liberation of our kababayan or Filipinos back home, simply because of the fact that we have migrated from our home countries or our mother countries for a reason. And that reason is really implicated in the larger global economic crisis that US imperialism plays a huge role in steering. And I guess that's the first and primary reason why we continue to organize our communities here. And then the second reason also is that being in the United States, we also see that there are communities that are severely repressed and oppressed under the same system. And we know that particularly the financing of repression from the US as a state is really imposed on Black and Brown Indigenous communities here in the US and abroad. So instead of sending, for example, a huge military finance to the Philippines, we know that funding can be used elsewhere here domestically to really invest in communities in need and our marginalized peoples. So regardless of whether or not we identify with our motherland, just being here in the United States, we have a responsibility to each other. And I think that that's really key in how we basically forge relationships and also how we choose to express our international solidarity. And I think one of the things I just wanted to lift up is that we also sometimes forget that people here in the US are part of an international, the international system, right? Even the peoples here in the US, just making that distinction that not everybody, just because we live here, of course, agrees with the policies, with the implementation of intervention abroad, but are much more so also victimized by its own domestic colonialism. So our role as Gabriela is just to really, highlight, how we can connect the struggle of what's happening in the Philippines to what's happening here in the United States, and how we can really bridge together our movements for liberation, so that we can be a stronger force to actually fight back against US imperialism.
Jess, I see that you've turned your video on. Would you like to add on?
Hey, yes, I just wanted to say, as somebody who does not identify as Filipinx, right? I'm part of a solidarity organization of non-Filipinx folks, right? Katarungan DC, that stands in solidarity with the people of the Philippines. And now, right, as the Katarungan rep to this alliance here, right, which is the DC International Women X Alliance. And so, I think this is the question of how do I view myself as a political person, right? I am political. Not because we think about politics, because I just talked about this with my students yesterday. And I think people think about politicization, oh my God, what does political mean? You think about politics. But when I think about myself as a political person, because, right, of how I benefit also, right, being here, on this occupied land, right, with the privileges that I hold, and being Korean American, right, what's the racialization of being Korean American, and the connection of really my own motherlands, right, and how the US occupied Korea, and and South Korea, and then kind of how my class background with my petty B parents really benefited from that, and also in our immigration story. So there's a direct kind of connection for me here, right? What is my role in the ways in which then Korea has never really invaded another country, but has always supported the invasion of other countries, right? Supported the colonization of those other countries. And so then I'm directly implicated here, especially in our role in Southeast Asia, and also here in my role, being here in the heart of imperialism, in the belly of the beast, and really in our collective liberation for Black folks here, right? And seeing, themselves as a domestic colony, as Quisha said, and, that we are all tied together. And so this is how I see our role in this alliance.
Thank you so much, Jess, for sharing your perspective. I hope that this, wow, that question one alone allowed us to all answer the steering committee of DIWA. And this is why we are continuously working and coming together as an alliance for our role of international solidarity and recognizing the violence both here and abroad. We do have one last video to share of a cultural performance, but we invite you to continue to utilize the chat and just even state the organizations that you're part of or not an organization that you're part of and what is resonating with you. As we transition to our last piece of a last cultural performance of Tibok, Malaya. They are a Philippinx group based in the Bay Area. They are a group of cultural workers fighting for freedom through music and creative expression. They were not able to be here live with us today, but they sent us a recording. Unfortunately, we don't have the translation. It is in Tagalog, but again, thank you all so much for being here. We hope you enjoy this cultural performance from Tibok, Malaya.
Maraming nagtapos ng cum laude, ang naging gahaman at pinador. Naging humas pangulo't alkalde, ngunit sa bayan ay traidor. Para na rin hindi ka nakapag-aral, para na rin hindi ka nakapasa. Wala ka sa dalukasan ng buhay. Wala, 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 wala. Pagkat ikagraduate ng palengke sa Universidad ng Kanto, sa kolehiyo ng kalye, sa pamantasan ng puso. At relihiyosong igual, ngunit kadalas ay kasosyo ng burokratismo at kapital. Ngunit ako'y may isang nakilala, sa kahirap ay di nakapagtapos. Nakikiramay siya't nakikibaka, nakikihanay sa nakikikaos. Pagkat siya'y kapit ng palengke sa Universidad ng Kanto, sa kolehiyo ng kalye, sa pamantasan ng puso. Ang tunay na nagkalayan, totoong nakakaunawa. Hindi sila mga henyo, kundi sa Universidad ng Kanto, sa kolehiyo ng kalye, sa pamantasan ng puso, sa pamantasan
Oh, I wish they were here live with us today. Please definitely check them out on Instagram at Tibok Malaya. I would just like to conclude this evening. Thank you for everyone who was able to stay with us till the very end. Thank you to our panelist speakers, our member organizations within DIWA, and hopefully you learned a little bit more about our alliance. If you are called to this work, please reach out to us. We are here for questions and also here for the struggle. I would like to conclude us with an isang bagsak. Isang bagsak means one down, one fall. And so I would like to do an isang bagsak to long live international solidarity as well as unity in resistance. Isang bagsak. Yes, thank you everyone. I hope you continue to be well and to stay safe. I will hop on the Spotify playlist again, and please be well. Let us know if you have any questions.
Left him on a Tuesday, found him on a Sunday. Cried when I saw my handkerchief in his suitcase. Letter folded neatly in his pocket with my perfume. Knew that he was lying when he told me he'd be back soon. I couldn't sleep the night he left me with a promise that he'd always keep me close when the struggle got the hardest. So I wiped the tears, tied the handkerchief around me, rallied up the troops so we could find a Spanish army. It was time to stop the crying, time to start the fighting. Love was the beginning, but my people steady dying. And so I promised him the same thing. Gabriela blast in the name of the Philippines. I can hear him in the back of my mind. He said, yeah, it can only be a matter of time. I said, being overseas when I heard about the blast, and I knew the little girls who were killed in Alabama. It was Carol, Addie Mae, Cynthia, and Denise, and the clan got away in cahoots with the police. Knew that it was coming when the Panthers started forming, so I booked the first flight to the States in the morning to show them my solidarity. Tightened up my afro, books in my hand, revolution in my heart, so I used my education to combat the injustice. More than Malcolm X and Martin Luther in the trenches.